The sun had barely cleared the horizon, its first light straining through a veil of dust that hung over the Ellison homestead like a shroud. In the late 1800s, New Mexico's plains stretched empty and wide, a harsh world where survival depended on grit, routine, and an endless reserve of hope. The Ellison Ranch had once been a place where laughter drifted from the barn at dawn and a team of horses thundered out at dusk, driven by a man whose voice was always raised in song or gentle instruction. But now, a heavy quiet filled the space between the sagging fences and the weathered house, pressing down on everything that remained. Martha Ellison stood at the edge of the porch, arms folded tight against her body, as if bracing herself against more than the wind. She was 36, and her face was shaped by years of sun and responsibility. Her husband's death had carved deeper lines, shadows beneath her blue eyes, a tightness around her mouth that never quite relaxed. She watched the pale cattle moving sluggishly in the morning haze, their numbers already too few. The wheat fields beyond lay untended, rough with weeds, and the only sound came from a single raven perched atop the old water pump, calling out as if to remind the world of what had been lost. Inside, the house was silent except for the occasional groan of the wind through the gaps in the window frames. Caleb, her 10-year-old son, sat at the kitchen table, shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on the untouched bread in front of him. He had not spoken a word in weeks, not since the accident that took his father's life. The boy flinched at every sudden noise and recoiled at the sight of horses, refusing to go near the stables where it happened. His world had shrunk to the space between his room and the kitchen, moving like a ghost through halls that were once filled with warmth and the steady rhythm of family. Martha moved through her days like someone chasing a memory. Every morning, she woke before dawn, brewed coffee that tasted of ashes, and set about the chores with mechanical precision. She fed the chickens, hauled buckets of water from the well, mended what she could, and let the rest go. There was always too much to do and never enough time or hands. Sometimes she caught herself listening for footsteps she would never hear again, a deep, familiar voice that would never answer. At night, exhaustion claimed her, but sleep offered no peace. Only the dull ache of dreams that faded with the morning light. She tried to talk to Caleb at first. She tried to coax him outside, tried to tell him it was all right to be afraid, to be sad, to cry if he needed. But he looked at her with eyes wide and wounded, and each word seemed to push him further away, until she gave up speaking at all. Silence became a third presence in their house, a shadow that crept along the walls and lingered at the foot of the stairs. The ranch itself seemed to mourn with them. Weeds grew thick where wheat once waved gold in the breeze. The horses, sensing something lost, grew restless in their stalls, stamping and tossing their heads at the scent of their absent master. The hired hands, a rough collection of men with nowhere else to go, drifted off one by one when the pay grew scarce and the work too heavy for a single woman to direct. By summer's end, only 2 remained, neither eager nor skilled, but desperate enough to linger. Martha knew it was only a matter of time before they left as well. She bore the weight of loss in everything she did, each fence post repaired, each bucket carried, each sleepless night. Every action a testament to a promise she made at her husband's grave. To keep the ranch alive, no matter what it took. But promises made in grief were hard to keep when hope slipped away with every passing day. On the edge of the property, a twisted grove of mesquite trees marked the spot where the accident happened. Martha avoided the place, but sometimes at dusk, she'd catch Caleb staring out the window toward the trees, lips pressed tight, hands clenched in his lap. He wouldn't go near them. He wouldn't go near the horses either. Not even Ginger, the gentle mare who had been his father's favorite. The ranch's heartbeat, once strong and certain, faltered with every passing week. One morning, Martha awoke to the sound of distant thunder, though the sky was clear. She realized it was the cattle, startled and running wild across the lower pasture. She rushed out, her boots heavy with mud, heart pounding in her chest. The corral gate hung open, swinging in the wind. No one had seen a thing. No one had been there to stop them. By the time she managed to gather the stragglers, several head were missing. She stood in the field, dust clinging to her skin. Grief and frustration rising in her throat until it threatened to choke her. The ranch was slipping through her fingers, and there was no one to help her hold on. Evenings brought a different kind of sorrow. After supper, Martha would sit at the kitchen table, sewing by lamplight, while Caleb lingered on the stairs, eyes fixed on the flickering flame. He never asked for stories. He never asked about his father. The silence between them grew wider with each passing night, a chasm neither of them seemed able or willing to cross. In those quiet hours, Martha wondered if the land itself was cursed, if all her efforts would ever be enough. She prayed for strength she was no longer sure she possessed, clutching the memory of her husband like a talisman against the darkness that threatened to swallow everything. Outside, the wind carried the scent of rain and the faintest echo of laughter from days gone by. A reminder that even in the loneliest places, hope could sometimes be found, if one only dared to look. The relentless sun showed no mercy as it crept higher over the dry plains. Days bled into one another with the same dull ache of loss and labor. For Martha, every sunrise felt heavier, her steps weighed down by the never-ending chores and the crushing quiet of a home left hollow by grief. Each dawn, she wondered if something, anything, might shift the stagnant sorrow that lingered in the air. It was on a wind-chapped afternoon, when the heat rippled over the land and the sky glared white, that Samuel Pike rode into their lives. He appeared on horseback, little more than a figure cut from shadow and dust, moving down the rutted road that led from town to the Ellison Ranch. No one saw him arrive but Martha, who paused at the barn, wiping sweat from her brow, a coil of rope slung over her shoulder. His hat brim shadowed his face. His clothes, though battered and patched, were tidy. A long, thin scar ran from his left temple to his jawline, like the ghost of an old wound no words could explain. Samuel dismounted without a word, tied his horse to the fence, and waited, shoulders relaxed but posture wary, as though he expected trouble to spring from the very ground. Martha eyed him from across the yard, torn between suspicion and the desperate need for help. No drifter ever lingered near a ranch unless he needed work or had trouble trailing behind him. And yet, there was something about the way Samuel stood, as if he'd learned the hard way how to be patient, how not to startle the already spooked. The encounter was short. She asked if he could mend a fence. He nodded and took up a hammer. There was little more to say. By sundown, the broken stretch of fence behind the barn stood straighter than it had in months, rails snug and even. Samuel worked with a quiet efficiency, never complaining, moving with a grace that hinted at a life once lived with purpose before being reduced to wandering. That night, Martha let him sleep in the empty bunkhouse, tossing him a wool blanket and a tin cup. She did not trust him yet, but the ranch needed more than just hope to survive, and Samuel's hands looked strong enough to handle both hammer and trouble. For the first time in weeks, She allowed herself to feel a tiny flicker of relief. Caleb, however, watched the newcomer with silent suspicion, his dark eyes following Samuel from a safe distance. He stayed out of sight, lurking behind doorways or slipping around corners, careful never to meet the drifter's gaze. The boy's silence seemed to deepen, weighed down by the presence of this stranger. Samuel noticed. He took his meals in silence at the end of the table, careful not to intrude, yet quietly observant. Unlike the hired hands before him, rough men whose impatience flared at a child's awkwardness, Samuel never raised his voice or scowled when Caleb disappeared at the sound of boots. He simply went about his work, mending tack, hauling water, and when the sun dipped low, sharpening tools by the glow of a lantern. Martha watched as Samuel gradually made himself useful, never once overstepping, never asking for more than his keep. She found herself studying him at dusk, when he'd sit outside and stare at the horizon, as if searching for a sign or a memory only he could see. His presence brought a kind of stillness, not peace exactly, but a steadiness that held chaos at bay. One morning, Martha found Samuel at the well, hauling buckets and setting them near the porch. Without a word, he fixed a loose hinge on the chicken coop, then showed Caleb how to gather eggs without startling the hens. He said nothing, letting the actions speak for themselves, and Caleb, wary but curious, copied him. The boy's hands trembled at first, but Samuel's calm patience seemed to ease the worst of his fear. Over the next days, Samuel found small ways to draw Caleb out. A game of stacking firewood, a race to see who could fill the water trough first. He never pushed. Instead, he allowed silence to fill the gaps, giving Caleb space to breathe. At the fence line, he handed Caleb a hammer and let him drive in the last nail, then nodded approval. Not with words, but with a small, satisfied smile. Gradually, the house began to feel less like a tomb. Chores became less of a burden as Samuel quietly taught Caleb to tie knots, fetch water, and feed the horses, not forcing him near the stalls, but showing him from a safe distance. Martha noticed her son's eyes follow Samuel's hands, noticed his posture loosen just a little. For the first time since her husband's death, hope fluttered, weak but real, somewhere deep within her chest. Evenings found Samuel sitting near the porch steps, whittling a piece of wood, his face set in quiet concentration. Caleb would edge closer, curious to see what the blade might reveal. A horse, a bird, a simple shape from his quiet imagination. In these small, silent moments, a fragile bond began to take root. Martha, wary of her own longing for connection, kept her distance, but every time she saw Samuel's gentle patience with Caleb, she felt a strange gratitude, one that frightened her as much as it comforted her. Grief still shadowed the ranch, but with Samuel's arrival, it no longer felt insurmountable. The land itself seemed to breathe easier, as if bracing for change. And as the days stretched into weeks, the Ellison homestead, long defined by silence and sorrow, began slowly to awaken. As the weeks rolled by, life on the Ellison ranch settled into an uneasy rhythm. Samuel's steady presence brought a measure of calm to the daily toil, but the undercurrent of grief lingered in every shadow, refusing to release its grip. Martha threw herself into the work with even more ferocity, as if by sheer will she could outrun the memories that haunted every room and field. She worked from dawn until her hands were raw and her muscles ached, determined to keep the ranch running and the wolves of debt and rumor at bay. Sometimes, as the first hints of pink light bled across the sky, she would catch sight of her own reflection in the kitchen window. Hair disheveled, eyes rimmed with exhaustion, a woman shaped by hardship and loss. She scarcely recognized the person staring back. Still, she refused to let herself break, refused to admit just how deeply her husband's absence gnawed at her spirit. Within the walls of the house, silence reigned supreme. Caleb moved quietly, drifting from room to room like a shadow himself, avoiding eye contact and slipping away whenever conversation threatened to draw him in. At night, Martha heard him whimpering through nightmares, his small voice muffled by the thin walls and the heavy quilt he pulled over his head. But when she tried to comfort him, he recoiled as if her touch might reopen wounds too fresh to bear. Samuel observed all of this with a kind of gentle wariness. He saw the distance growing between mother and son, the invisible wall built higher with every word left unspoken and every feeling pushed down. It was a familiar pain, one he recognized from the ruins of his own past. He remembered a time when he too had tried to bury grief beneath hard work and stoic silence, only to find that sorrow had a way of seeping through the cracks, poisoning even the simplest joys. He watched Martha ignore her own suffering, pouring every drop of energy into the ranch. And he saw the way Caleb flinched from affection, shrinking into himself. Samuel tried to help in small ways, a kind word here, a patient gesture there, but the wounds ran deep, and he knew better than to force what could not be rushed. Healing, he understood, was a slow and stubborn process. One wind-blown afternoon, as storm clouds gathered on the horizon, Samuel caught Martha out by the barn, her arms laden with tack that needed mending. She worked in silence, her brow furrowed in concentration, jaw set tight against the biting wind. He offered to help, and for a moment, their hands brushed as they both reached for the same bridle. She froze, startled by the accidental contact, then pulled away quickly, her eyes darkening with an emotion she couldn't name. Samuel did not press her. Instead, he busied himself with repairs, his quiet competence a kind of balm against the growing tension. He spoke little, choosing instead to listen, to the creak of leather, the distant rumble of thunder, the uneasy hush that had settled over the ranch. He listened, too, to the stories told in silence, the way Martha's hands shook ever so slightly when she thought no one was watching, the way Caleb lingered in doorways, as if afraid of both presence and absence. That evening, as Martha prepared supper, Samuel gathered his courage. He had seen too much pain left to rot in the darkness, seen the way it could twist a person's heart and poison a family from within. As they sat at the table, the air thick with unspoken words, he cleared his throat and spoke, not in grand pronouncements or flowery language, but in simple truth. He told Martha that grief could not be buried forever, that the wounds left by loss would only fester if ignored. He reminded her that her son needed more than just food and shelter. He needed a mother who could share the pain, who could let him see that sorrow did not have to be carried alone. Martha bristled at first, defensive, anger flaring in her eyes. But as Samuel's words settled into the quiet, she realized he was not judging, only urging her to let herself feel what she had tried so hard to forget. After Samuel left the table, Martha sat in the dim glow of the lantern, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She thought of the early days with her husband, his laughter echoing across the fields, his strong arms encircling her, the promise of a future they had built together. She thought of the accident, of the blood and the chaos, of Caleb's screams echoing through the barn. She realized with a sudden wrenching clarity that she had not truly mourned. She had simply locked the grief away, refusing to look at it for fear that it might swallow her whole. That night, as a storm lashed against the windows, Martha finally allowed herself to weep. Quiet, desperate tears that soaked her pillow and shook her to the core. Down the hall, Caleb heard the muffled sobs and pulled the covers tighter around his body, unsure whether to be afraid or relieved that his mother's silence had finally broken. The next morning, the world felt subtly changed. The ranch was still battered, the work still endless, but something had shifted in the air, a sense that, for the first time, the Ellison family was no longer entirely alone with their pain. The days after the storm brought a restless, uneasy calm to the Ellison ranch. Rain had left puddles in the yard, and the smell of wet earth hung in the air, mixing with the faint, comforting scents of hay and old wood. Life moved forward in cautious steps, chores divided, meals shared, the ache of grief now a companion instead of an enemy lurking in every shadow. It was during this fragile truce that Caleb wandered, alone and restless, toward the barn. He often slipped out in the afternoons, drawn by memories he could neither banish nor understand. The barn, once a place of comfort where his father taught him to ride and care for the animals, had become a forbidden land in his mind, a place haunted by loss. But something inside him pulled him there, as if answers might be hidden within the dust and silence. He crept past the old stalls and rusted tools, letting his fingers brush over harnesses that still carried the faint imprint of his father's strong hands. In the farthest corner, behind a pile of feed sacks, Caleb noticed something he had not seen before: a battered chest, half buried beneath the clutter of forgotten things. The lock was old but fragile. With trembling hands, he pried it open, the creak of metal loud in the barn's stillness. Inside, he found papers, bundles of yellowed pages bound with rough twine. He reached in, heart pounding, and drew out one of the journals. The handwriting was instantly familiar. Strong, steady lines that had once written him bedtime stories, that had marked ledgers and left notes on the kitchen table. They were his father's journals. Caleb sat on a hay bale, the sunlight slanting through a crack in the boards, and read. The entries began years ago, hopes and plans for the ranch, the first years of marriage, dreams of expansion and prosperity. But as he turned the pages, the words grew heavier. His father wrote about sleepless nights, about debts that crept up like weeds, about the loneliness that sometimes settled in even amidst family. He wrote unsent letters to Martha, confessing his fears and regrets. Some pages were stained with tears, the ink running in places where heartbreak refused to be contained. As the words soaked into him, Caleb understood something he never had before. His father had not been invincible. He had struggled with fear and worry, just as Caleb did now. The realization was like a door opening inside him, letting in air that had grown stale and suffocating. For the first time, he saw his father not as a giant lost to tragedy, but as a man who had carried his burdens quietly, too quietly, perhaps, for the sake of those he loved. That evening, after much hesitation, Caleb brought the journals to the house and left them on the kitchen table. Martha found them after supper, her hands still damp from the wash basin. She stared at the battered covers, unsure whether to touch them or leave them be. For a long moment, she simply stood there, the weight of memory pressing in. At last, she opened one and began to read. With every page, her breath caught and her hands trembled. She read her husband's hopes, his private doubts, the lines he never dared speak aloud. She read of the nights he spent watching over Caleb when he was sick, of the pride he felt at Martha's strength and resilience, and of the moments when fear for the future nearly drove him to despair. It shook her to the core. The man she loved had been suffering in silence, just as she had. His love had always been steady, but his pain had been hidden, buried beneath layers of duty and pride. Tears welled in her eyes as she realized how much had gone unsaid between them, how much they had both sacrificed in the name of protecting each other. In those quiet hours, Martha was forced to confront a truth she had long avoided, that her grief was not unique, that she and Caleb were not alone in their pain. The silence she had maintained, her refusal to speak of her husband's death, to let Caleb see her cry, had not spared her son from suffering. It had only taught him to hide his own wounds, to turn inward and face the darkness alone. When Martha closed the last journal, dawn was breaking, painting gold along the window's edge. She went to Caleb's room and stood in the doorway, her heart aching with regret and longing. She watched him sleeping, clutching one of the journals to his chest. The lines of fear on his face softened in rest. For the first time since her husband's death, she let herself imagine a future not defined by loss, but by the possibility of healing. From that morning on, something changed between mother and son. There were still tears and difficult days, but the walls of silence began to crumble. Martha spoke of their loss, and in turn, Caleb found his voice again, if only in small, hesitant bursts. They grieved together, and together they began to heal. Yet the ranch, always watchful, seemed to sense a new storm on the horizon, one that would test every fragile bond they had managed to rebuild. Summer's end in New Mexico brought a brittle tension to the air. Days growing shorter, shadows stretching longer across the thirsty land. On the Ellison Ranch, the fragile progress made by Martha and Caleb felt as if it might finally weather the worst of storms. The silence between them, once impenetrable, had softened. Chores were done together now, and at night, the lamplight saw Martha reading aloud from her husband's journals while Caleb listened, his gaze steady and clear. The land remained scarred, but in the faces of mother and son, hope was a stubborn bloom. Then, one afternoon, trouble arrived in the form of a man who bore the Ellison name but none of its honor. Rufus Ellison came riding down the lane on a black horse, his boots caked with dust and his eyes hard as flint. It had been years since he'd set foot on this ranch, estranged by old quarrels and a lifetime of bad choices. Now, with the death of his brother, he returned, not to mourn, but to claim. He wore his arrogance like armor. Dismounting, he strode up to the porch and demanded to speak with Martha. She met him at the door, Caleb lingering anxiously behind her, and Samuel watching from the yard with a narrowed gaze. Rufus produced a battered folder, its corners worn and edges stained. Inside were papers, official-looking, marked by signatures and seals, each one suggesting that Rufus had some right to half the ranch. The moment Martha read the documents, her heart hammered with dread. Rufus spoke in clipped, taunting tones. He called her a weak widow, sneered at her efforts to run the ranch, and waved the papers like a weapon. Martha tried to stand her ground, voice steady but shaking inside. The truth of the matter was tangled in legalese and old wounds, but Rufus insisted the ranch was as much his as hers, and he wanted his due, either half the land or half its worth. Caleb watched his mother's face, searching for reassurance and finding only the mask of worry she wore too well. Rufus's arrival unsettled him in ways he could not express. It was as if, with this man's return, the threat of losing everything he'd just begun to reclaim was suddenly real. He remembered nights of hunger when the cattle strayed, and the loneliness that pressed down on his chest. The fear that his home might slip away returned with every mocking word Rufus spat in his mother's direction. Samuel remained silent as the tension built, choosing not to escalate, but his presence was steady, one calm figure standing between the Ellisons and the man who would see them undone. Rufus noticed, smirking at the drifter's loyalty and muttering that no hired hand could change the law or the future. From that day on, the ranch carried a new weight, a sense that the ground itself had shifted. Rufus did not leave, instead settling into the old bunkhouse as if it were his birthright. He brought with him a pair of rough men, both loyal more to his coin than his character, and together they prowled the property like wolves waiting for the flock to falter. Rufus swaggered through the fields, tossing careless orders, kicking up dust and spitting at the name of his late brother. He mocked Martha openly, laughing at the sight of her struggling to keep up, and warned her that it was only a matter of time before she lost it all. Martha tried to seek help in town, but word spread quickly and sympathy ran thin. The law in those parts was tangled in favoritism and old debts, and nobody wanted to take sides in a family quarrel. Whispers followed her wherever she went, that a woman alone could not keep a ranch, that the Ellison land was cursed by tragedy, that it would be better sold and split than lost to drought or worse. The strain crept into every corner of the house. Caleb grew quiet again, the taste of fear thick in his mouth. Each night, he asked if they would have to leave, if the ranch would be taken from them. Martha, though desperate to reassure him, could not offer the certainty he needed. She lay awake, mind racing through the possibilities, fighting in court, losing the land, seeing her husband's legacy broken by greed. Samuel noticed the change in both mother and son. He kept close, fixing what he could around the property, staying alert for signs of trouble. When he spoke to Martha, it was in quiet moments away from Rufus's gaze, urging her to remember her own strength. He reminded her that the ranch was not just soil and timber, but the heart of everything her family had built. Rufus's presence brought more than words. He planted seeds of doubt in Caleb's heart, whispering of better lives elsewhere, hinting at riches that could be theirs if only they gave up this fight. But underneath the swagger, there was a simmering anger, an impatience that grew each time Martha refused to back down. As days passed, the very air seemed thick with coming violence. Rufus stalked the grounds with eyes sharp for weakness, and Martha's resolve was tested again and again. Caleb, caught between hope and fear, clung tighter to his mother and to the fragile peace that Samuel's calm brought to their battered home. The Ellison Ranch, battered but unbroken, stood as a quiet battleground, its future balanced on a knife's edge, waiting for the storm to break. Tension settled over the Ellison Ranch like a dry thundercloud, heavy and slow-moving, its weight felt in every corner of the land. With Rufus Ellison and his 2 men prowling the property, Martha found sleep hard to come by. Each sunrise brought new reasons for vigilance, as if the ranch itself was bracing for a blow that everyone knew was coming, but no one could predict. It didn't take long. The first sign of trouble came at dawn, when Martha discovered the east pasture's fence had been cut in 2 places. Barbed wire dangled loose, and hoofprints trailed off into the brush. 3 head of cattle had vanished during the night. There was no evidence, no witnesses, and no apology. Rufus played dumb, his men offering only shrugs and smirks, while Martha's stomach twisted with anger and dread. Samuel was up before anyone, surveying the damage. He worked silently beside Martha, pulling the heavy wire tight, resetting fence posts, and tamping down earth with practiced determination. Each task was a message. The ranch would not fall easily. But for every fix they managed, another blow soon followed. The next day, the well water tasted strange. By noon, 2 horses fell ill, froth at their lips and fear in their rolling eyes. Martha dropped to her knees, scooping up a handful of water and sniffing, then glancing toward the distant tree line where Rufus's men sometimes loitered, smoking and laughing. There was no proof, only suspicion. She did what she could for the animals, praying over them in the cool darkness of the barn, refusing to let them die without a fight. At night, shadows moved where they shouldn't, quick shapes slipping between the sheds, whispers on the wind. The cattle, restless and spooked, bunched together in tight clusters, as if they too sensed the storm brewing. The old ranch dog barked and whined until his voice grew hoarse. Caleb, frightened, began to sleep with a lamp burning beside his bed, clutching his father's journal for comfort. Every day brought new sabotage, a shattered trough here, a pile of feed spoiled there. Samuel's patience never wavered. He worked tirelessly, guiding Caleb through chores, teaching him to patch a fence, to spot footprints, to keep watch when the grown-ups' backs were turned. Under Samuel's quiet instruction, the boy learned resilience, not through words, but through the rhythm of survival, the silent pact that bound them to the land and to each other. Rufus reveled in the chaos. He prowled the property, barking orders at his men, mocking Martha's determination. His threats grew more brazen, delivered with a sneer and a tilt of his battered hat. "You're losing this place, little by little," he would mutter as he strode past the porch, kicking up dust with every heavy step. Martha held her ground, refusing to be cowed, but each day took a little more from her, worn down by the relentless pressure. Yet with every attack, a strange kind of unity grew between Martha, Caleb, and Samuel. They ate together in the kitchen, heads bowed in tired solidarity. They shared the burden of every loss and found small moments of laughter in the work, a fleeting smile or a gentle pat on the shoulder. Martha watched as Samuel taught Caleb how to braid a lasso, his big hands guiding the boy's smaller ones, their focus so intent that for a moment, fear receded. The sabotage grew worse. One night, as thunder rumbled in the distance, the barn doors were left unlatched. In the confusion of the wind and dark, Rufus's men scattered the cattle, waving lanterns and shouting until the animals stampeded through the fields. Martha, barefoot and breathless, chased after them beneath the angry sky, her heart pounding as she herded them back one by one. In the flickering lightning, she saw Samuel riding at the far edge of the pasture, rounding up strays, his silhouette framed against the wild horizon. Caleb, too, was swept up in the urgency. For the first time since his father's death, he moved without hesitation, dragging a stray calf to safety, slamming the barn doors shut, his face set with grim resolve. In the morning, when the dust had settled and the animals were safe, he collapsed on the steps beside Samuel, hands scraped and knees bruised, but eyes bright with pride. The boy who once flinched from the world now met it head-on, driven by loyalty and the determination to save what little they had left. Rufus, seeing his campaign met with resistance, grew angrier. His men, emboldened by his temper, hinted at worse things to come. Each night, Samuel made the rounds with his rifle, moving quietly through the darkness, ever watchful for a new threat. Martha watched him from the porch, her gratitude and fear warring inside her. The ranch endured, scarred, battered, but unbroken. With every trial, Martha felt her resolve harden, her grief transforming into a fierce, protective love for her son and her land. Samuel's steady presence became a pillar, and Caleb's newfound courage a source of hope. Yet all knew the worst was yet to come. The tension crackled in the hot, dry air, promising that the next blow would not be so easily mended. The day began with a hush, the air so still it pressed against the skin like a warning. By late afternoon, thunderheads gathered above the Ellison Ranch, piling high and dark until the horizon itself seemed to vanish beneath their weight. Martha felt the tension as a physical ache in her chest. She moved through her chores, checking and rechecking the windows and doors, watching the sky. The animals sensed the change. Horses pawed and whinnied. Chickens refused to leave the coop. Cattle pressed against the fences, nervous and tight. As dusk fell, a fierce wind swept across the plains, whipping dust into angry spirals and rattling every loose board on the property. Lightning flickered in the distance, followed by the deep, rolling growl of thunder. Samuel came in from the yard, rain already streaking down his hat and coat, and locked the barn doors with extra care. Caleb watched him with wide eyes, the boy's small body vibrating with unease as the storm rolled ever closer. But the storm outside was nothing compared to the one waiting to break inside their borders. It began with a shout, sharp and mean, echoing through the rain-soaked darkness. Rufus and his men, faces twisted with greed and desperation, emerged from the blackness like wolves. They circled the house, brandishing rifles and lanterns, their shadows looming long and wild against the staccato flash of lightning. Martha braced herself at the kitchen window, rifle in hand. Samuel stood by her side, eyes narrowed, body taut with readiness. The world shrank to the creaking house, the steady breath of her son, the drumbeat of her heart. When the first shot split the night, it was less a surprise than an inevitability. Glass shattered. The door shuddered under the force of Rufus's boot. Samuel fired back, ducking low and signaling to Martha. She herded Caleb behind the heavy kitchen table, her body forming a shield, her mind racing with every possible outcome. Fear screamed in her blood. But it was anchored by something stronger, a determination that no one would take what was left of her family. Rain lashed the windows. The wind howled like a banshee, swallowing the shouts and curses outside. Caleb, wide-eyed and shaking, clutched a box of bullets, handing them up with trembling fingers. He found his voice in the chaos, shouting warnings as shadows danced across the floor and footsteps thudded along the porch. For the first time since his father's death, his fear was not a cage but a weapon, a force that drove him forward, compelled him to act. The house became a battleground. Rufus's men tried the doors, battered the shutters, crawled along the walls seeking any weakness. Samuel moved through the rooms with quiet certainty, checking corners, watching for movement. He traded shots with the attackers, each one booming like thunder, each one driving home the terrible reality of the night. Martha's hands shook, but she held her ground. When Rufus tried to force the door, she raised her rifle and fired, splintering wood and forcing him back into the storm. In that moment, the old pain of loss and fear was replaced by the fierce, undeniable love of a mother defending her child and her home. Outside, lightning split the sky. For a heartbeat, everything was exposed. Rufus snarling at the porch, his men ducking for cover, the ranch animals fleeing in panic. Rain poured from the roof in torrents, flooding the yard, soaking the gunmen to the bone. The chaos was total. Smoke, thunder, shouting, the crash of boots on wet boards. At the height of the storm, Rufus lunged through a broken window, roaring Martha's name. Samuel was there, his own rifle raised. They met in the center of the kitchen, two men bound by blood and tragedy, now separated by rage. The fight was brutal, desperate. Martha shouted for Caleb to stay back, but the boy refused. He ducked behind the stove, grabbing cartridges, passing them up when Samuel needed them most. The struggle spilled into the hallway. Samuel, battered and bleeding, found his mark and fired. Rufus went down, clutching his side, a howl of pain lost in the thunder's roar. Outside, the sound of hooves and shouted orders pierced the night. The sheriff and his deputies, alerted by the gunfire, swept onto the property with lanterns and drawn guns. Lawmen flooded the house, weapons raised, demanding surrender. Rufus's men dropped their rifles, scrambling into the mud. The sheriff found Rufus where he fell, blood soaking his shirt, eyes wild with hatred. Even as they hauled him to his feet and dragged him out into the storm, he twisted around, spitting curses and threats, vowing to return, vowing to ruin the family he blamed for every misfortune in his bitter life. When it was over, silence returned, broken only by the rain beating down and the shuddering breaths of those left standing. Martha collapsed to her knees, clutching Caleb, while Samuel leaned against the wall, spent and shaking, blood mingling with rainwater on the battered kitchen floor. But in that battered house, something new had taken root. In facing the storm together, their fractured family had found a core of strength, a stubborn unity that even the darkest night could not destroy. The days that followed the storm confrontation were bruised and restless. Rain continued to fall in scattered fits, leaving the land slick and the air heavy. The Ellison Ranch bore the marks of battle, shattered glass, pitted doors, bullet holes scarring the walls. But Martha, Samuel, and Caleb had weathered the onslaught together, their bond strengthened by shared danger. Even the townsfolk, curious and surprised by the family's defiance, kept their distance and their opinions quieter now. The sheriff's visit was brief but pointed. Rufus, handcuffed and sullen, was taken to the county jail under heavy guard. His words, promises of revenge, muttered curses, echoed in Martha's mind long after his wagon rolled out of sight. Night after night, the family rebuilt. Samuel and Martha hammered new boards across windows, cleaned broken glass from every corner, and repaired what they could. Caleb, still shaken but steadier than before, took to helping Samuel in the barn, sweeping out the stalls and feeding the horses, his movements careful but no longer driven by fear. Sometimes, after dark, Martha would find him standing by Ginger's stall, the gentle mare nuzzling his shoulder, the boy's voice a soft whisper as he read from his father's journal. Hope flickered, fragile and persistent, in the hard-won quiet. But peace on the high plains was always borrowed. Beneath the new sense of unity, a restless tension remained. Rufus's threats hung in the air like a storm not yet spent. Martha knew too well the darkness a desperate man could bring. Still, she refused to live in dread. Her family had survived the worst night of their lives. She would not let fear win again. The final blow came on a night thick with summer heat, the moon veiled by low clouds. The air was unnaturally still. Martha couldn't sleep, her body tuned to the hush, the kind that always signals trouble. She was sitting at the kitchen table, lamp dimmed, when the first scent of smoke drifted through the window, a strange, acrid edge that sent her heart leaping into her throat. She rushed outside, Samuel already at her side, both of them scanning the yard. At the far end of the property, beyond the fields, a flicker of orange leapt into the sky. Fire, bright and wild, was consuming the barn, the dry timber catching with terrifying speed. For a heartbeat, Martha's body froze, paralyzed by memories of loss. Then instinct took over. They raced for the barn, the air growing hotter with every step, smoke burning their throats and eyes. Caleb stumbled from the house, barefoot and frantic, clutching his father's journal to his chest. Flames licked the roof, devouring beams and casting wild shadows across the corral. From within the barn came the panicked cries of horses, trapped, terrified. Samuel didn't hesitate. He plunged into the burning structure, face wrapped in a wet bandana, arms raised to shield his eyes. Martha and Caleb fought to open the side door, the heat blistering their skin. Together, with strength born of terror and love, they freed the latches and drove the horses into the night. Ginger came last, nearly blinded by smoke, but Caleb called to her, his voice finally strong, finally sure, and the mare stumbled to his side, pressing her nose into his shaking hands. Outside, embers swirled through the sky. Samuel reappeared, coughing and soot-streaked, leading the last of the horses to safety. In the yard, they watched as the barn collapsed in a shower of sparks, the roof caving in, the walls folding inward with a final deafening roar. The loss was devastating. Inside, everything they'd rebuilt, tack, feed, tools, gone in a single hateful act. Martha knelt in the dirt, arms around Caleb, her eyes shining with tears she refused to let fall. Samuel stood silent, one arm braced against a fence post, watching the flames consume more than just wood and hay. They all knew, without question, that Rufus was behind it. His threats had not been empty, and the county jail was no match for a man's cunning or his rage. The law might catch him again, or it might not. It hardly mattered now. The wound had been dealt. But as the first gray light crept across the land, something else dawned as well. They had survived the night, together. Martha looked at Samuel, at her son, and at the blackened shell of the barn. The land was scarred. Their future was uncertain. Yet she felt a kind of strength that went beyond endurance. A hard, clean resolve that would not bend. Loss had not broken them. Fire had not scattered them. Through danger, heartbreak, and flame, they had stood side by side. Neighbors arrived by midday, drawn by the column of smoke and the story it told. Some offered tools, others brought food, and a few stayed to help clear the ashes. The support was small, but real. In every gesture, Martha saw respect, a recognition not just of survival, but of the fierce, unyielding will that kept the Ellison Ranch alive. As the sun set, the family sat together outside, watching the last embers die. For the first time since her husband's death, Martha felt a true sense of peace. Not the absence of trouble, but the presence of love, the quiet knowledge that whatever storms might come, they would face them together. The charred remains of the barn smoldered for days, sending thin plumes of smoke into the sky like signals of defeat. Word of the fire and the attack swept through the small towns and ranches that dotted the New Mexico plain. Some people arrived in the days that followed, offering scraps of aid and awkward words. Others only stared, watching from a distance, as if measuring how much a family could take before finally breaking. With the barn gone and supplies ruined, Martha faced her darkest trial yet. Each dawn, she forced herself from bed, body heavy with exhaustion and spirit battered by fear of what else Rufus or the world might bring. The sheriff, apologetic but useless, could offer no assurance. He could not promise Rufus would be found, nor could he ease the burden of suspicion that had taken root in town. Martha heard the whispers before she even reached the general store. Women leaned together, casting sidelong glances as she passed. Men muttered into their beards, voices lowered, but words sharp enough to sting. "A woman can't run a ranch," they said. "She ought to sell before she starves. She'll end up on the street or worse. Maybe she'd do well to find herself a man, someone to protect her, someone to take over what her husband left behind." Each comment was a lash. Martha kept her chin high, shoulders squared beneath the weight of every sideways look and cold word. She knew what they wanted, what the world expected of widows on the edge of nowhere: to quit, to run, to marry for safety. It would be easier to give in, to sign away the land for a pittance, to let go of the only thing she'd ever fought for. But as she stood at the store counter, her hands calloused and cracked, she remembered every sacrifice that had built the ranch and every moment her family had survived together. Back at home, she found Samuel tending what was left of the herd, his movements steady and reassuring. Caleb swept ash from the yard, the boy's face set with determination that was new and hard-won. There was no time for self-pity, no room for surrender. Every chore done was an act of defiance, a promise to herself, to her son, and to the memory of the man who had built the ranch by her side. Days passed, each one a test of will and grit. A dry wind blew through the ruined barn, scattering ashes. The house grew quieter in the afternoons, as if holding its breath, waiting for whatever came next. Martha gathered what little money she had, trading for supplies she could barely afford, stretching every dollar until it screamed. At night, she lay awake, staring at the cracked ceiling, haunted by doubts she never dared speak aloud. Would Caleb be safe here? Was she risking everything for pride? Had her strength finally run out? Caleb, sensing his mother's struggle, began to change in ways subtle but sure. He woke early, sometimes before dawn, ready to help Samuel with the animals or fetch water from the well. The boy who had once shied away from every challenge now stood tall, refusing to let the weight of loss keep him from moving forward. He remembered Samuel's quiet lessons, that family was more than blood, that courage was found not in the absence of fear, but in facing it, day after day. It was Samuel, too, who quietly bolstered Martha's resolve. He never offered false comfort or empty promises. Instead, he worked alongside her in silence, sharing the burden of labor and the ache of uncertainty. In the evenings, when Martha's hands shook from exhaustion, Samuel would set a steaming cup of coffee on the table and nod. No words, just the solid, reassuring presence that had become the ranch's new foundation. When rumors swirled that Martha would remarry for security, Samuel let the talk roll past him like wind through grass. To him, family was forged by hardship and loyalty, not the approval of townsfolk. He reminded Martha, when the world's judgment grew too loud, that she was stronger than they knew. He pointed out, gently, that it was the land and the people you chose to stand by you that mattered, not the gossip of those who only watched from the sidelines. As August faded to September, the land slowly began to heal. Neighbors, some out of genuine respect, others out of curiosity, offered small kindnesses: a bundle of feed, a team to help rebuild a shed, a meal delivered at dusk. Each gesture chipped away at the wall of doubt and isolation. Martha accepted help, her pride tempered by necessity and by the memory of that night's flames. The ranch was still battered, its scars visible to all who passed, but there was no denying the stubborn resilience that kept it alive. Caleb, stronger and more open, rode out with Samuel each morning, returning dusty but proud, the boys' laughter returning to the land with every passing week. Martha stood at the edge of her fields one evening, watching her son and the man who had become more than a hired hand. In that quiet, she finally understood. Survival was not the absence of fear or hardship, but the refusal to let them define you. She would not let prejudice or Rufus's hate or the world's doubts determine the future of the Ellison Ranch. In the gathering dusk, as the first stars blinked awake, Martha allowed herself to hope, not for a return to what was lost, but for a new legacy, built from the ashes of all they had endured. Time pressed onward, as it always did on the New Mexico plains, marking its passing in the slow regrowth of grass, where fire had licked the earth bare, and in the measured return of life to the battered Ellison Ranch. Each sunrise brought a small victory. Fewer embers in the wind, more green on the fields, the steady, hopeful rhythm of chores completed and ground reclaimed. The homestead still bore scars, but these now stood as badges of survival rather than wounds of defeat. Neighbors came and went, their visits shifting from cautious curiosity to genuine respect. They saw Martha not as a tragic widow, but as a woman of uncommon resolve, her hands calloused, her back straight, her eyes clear. Some brought lumber, others the simple gift of company or the loan of a horse. As word spread, even those who once doubted found themselves admiring her determination, unwilling to speak against the family that had stood, unyielding, through fire and fury. Martha's strength had become the heartbeat of the ranch, but it was not hers alone. Samuel, once a nameless drifter, had rooted himself in the land through quiet action and fierce loyalty. His scars, both seen and unseen, became part of the story, woven into the fields he helped till, the fences he mended, and the trust he offered freely to Martha and Caleb. In his presence, the ranch found a steady anchor, a man shaped by hardship but softened by purpose, by found family. For Caleb, the change was most profound. The boy who once ran from the sight of horses now moved among them with the calm assurance of someone who had known both fear and the triumph of facing it. He spent long hours with Ginger and the others, learning the cadence of hooves on dry ground, the subtle language of ears and eyes and breath. Sometimes he would ride out alone to the edge of the pasture, his father's journal pressed to his chest, reading the words of a man who had loved and struggled and ultimately taught him the greatest lesson of all, that courage is born not in the absence of pain, but in the choice to keep moving through it. The barn was rebuilt, stronger and larger than before. Neighbors lent their hands, and even those who once whispered about the fate of widows found themselves driven by the quiet pride of shared effort. The new walls stood white in the sun, a promise that nothing was ever truly lost if one had the strength to begin again. Inside, Martha placed a single memento, a horseshoe found in the ashes, nailed above the door to remind all who entered that hardship could forge more than sorrow. Seasons shifted, wheat once again rippled golden beneath the wind. Cattle grazed in peaceful clusters, and the clatter of tools gave way to the simple music of daily life. Samuel stayed on, not as a laborer, but as family, his place at the table never questioned, his advice and comfort woven into the days. In the cool evenings, he'd sit beside Martha on the porch, watching the sky burn orange and violet, both of them silent and content. having learned that sometimes presence was all the comfort needed. The wounds left by Rufus's violence faded, but their lessons remained. Martha had come to understand that family was forged by loyalty and love, not just blood. That the truest strength came from meeting struggle head-on and refusing to be diminished by it. Caleb flourished beneath this new certainty. He grew tall and strong, his laughter as common now as his silences once were, his courage a living testament to what a child could become when given the chance to heal. On the anniversary of her husband's passing, Martha led Caleb and Samuel to the grove of mesquite, where a simple wooden cross marked the grave. She knelt, pressing her palm to the earth, feeling grief and gratitude mingle at last. Caleb placed his father's journal there for a moment, pages fluttering in the wind, the story of a family written in hope and sorrow, trial and triumph. That evening, the ranch was filled with a rare, quiet joy. Samuel played his harmonica while Martha and Caleb watched the stars blink awake, the vast western sky arching above them in endless promise. The hardships they had survived, loss, fire, fear, betrayal, were no longer chains but stepping stones, each one leading to a new beginning. And so, beneath that endless sky, the Ellison Ranch flourished, not because it was spared from struggle, but because it endured. Because grief had been faced and truth spoken, because family had chosen one another, and because love, hard-won and unshakable, had taken root deeper than the fiercest drought. As dawn crested the distant hills, Caleb rode out across the plain, his shadow stretching long and free. Martha watched him go. Her heart no longer weighted with dread, but lifted by a peace she had not known in years. This, she realized, was the legacy she and her family would leave. Not a ranch untouched by hardship, but a life built upon it. A testament to resilience, to hope, and to the quiet power of loving fiercely, no matter what storms might come.